All right. All right, let's do it. Part 16. Recursive Radicalism of Nick Fuentes. This is part 16. The sovereign who disappoints, cycles of betrayal, expectation, partial victories, and complete transformations. Every populist sovereign becomes in time a mirror for the hopes he cannot fulfill. A leader who promises revolution but delivers reform becomes judged not against possibility but against fantasy. The sovereign inherits a broken machine, yet is blamed for not transforming it instantly. Impatient dissolves into accusation. A partisan base forgives failure until it begins to suspect indifference. Then forgiveness hardens into contempt. Reform is slow not because leaders are weak, but because institutions defend themselves with procedural armor. A sovereign who delivers half measures sows twice the anger, once from opponents who wanted none of it, and once from supporters who wanted all of it. The longer a leader remains in power, the more he becomes hostage to forces he once promised to overthrow. Sovereigns are judged not by what they changed, but by what they failed to prevent. Supporters tolerate incompetence but not betrayal. They tolerate delay but not perceived capitulation. A populist leader must choose please the donors and lose the base, or please the base and imperil the stability of the system he governs. Every generation of voters is eventually told to wait 2 more years until patience itself becomes a form of indoctrination. The sovereign who warns the alternative is worse is already losing his claim to legitimacy. When the gap between promise and performance becomes unbridgeable, rhetoric mutates into resentment. The question, what does he truly serve? Fucking idiot. The sovereign who disappoints, what does he truly serve, becomes the central inquiry of disillusioned citizens. A movement survives betrayal only when it distinguishes between its sovereign and its mission. The ultimate disappointment is not failure, it is the sense that the fight was never fought at all. Populism decays when it becomes indistinguishable from the establishment it sought to replace. The sovereign who inherits fire must learn to wield it. If not, he is consumed by it. The tyrant's temptation and the softening of liberty. Yeah, we're just reading. That's right. Are we just reading? Yeah, until I get some more people who are watching this, then we can actually interact with questions about what I'm reading. These are my writings. I am Abe Zucca. Check out my art at zuccagallery.com. Check out my prior projects on the channel. Fractal Islam, The Unborn Levels of Scientology, and Stalin's Closed System of Colossus. Right now we're on part 16 of Recursive Radicalism, Tyrant's Temptation and the Softening of Liberty. How power drifts towards absolutism, how liberty dissolves not through force, but fatigue. Every sovereign confronts a moment when the machinery of law seems too slow, too encumbered, too burdened by inherited restraint. And in that moment, the temptation arises to streamline the state by thinning its liberties, to accelerate justice by centralizing power, to fix dysfunction by concentrating authority in the hands able to wield it. The tyrant's temptation does not begin with cruelty, but with efficiency. It whispers that freedom is messy, slow, and counterproductive, that liberty is a luxury ill-suited for an imperiled nation, and that a decisive hand is more compassionate than endless deliberation. Liberty softens not because the sovereign crushes it, but because the populace becomes exhausted by its maintenance. The daily labor protecting freedom feels heavy compared to the seductive ease of paternal order. Citizens surrender rights incrementally, trading them for the promise of safety, order, stability, never realizing that the trade is never temporary and the state never returns what it once acquired. In every polity, there emerges a class that sees the institutions as obstacles rather than safeguards. These are the midwives of centralized authority, the bureaucrats of destiny who argue that extraordinary times justify extraordinary powers. The softening of liberty is camouflaged by rhetoric. The tightening of surveillance is called protection. The expansion of executive power, streamlining. The erosion of dissent, unity. A state does not leap into tyranny, it reclines into it comfortably, gradually, with cushions provided by crisis, real or manufactured. The tyrant never names himself tyrant, he names himself steward, guardian, healer, restorer, and the populace. Wanting reassurance, accepts the renaming. Liberty erodes fastest where fear is most easily ignited. Each crisis becomes an opportunity for the state to harden its grip, justified by the citizen's own panic. The sovereign who yields to the temptation inevitably convinces himself that only he can save the nation, that constraint hinders salvation, that law is too fragile to bear the weight of chaos. The worst tyrannies emerge not from hatred but from conviction. The ruler who believes he alone sees the future becomes the ruler who cannot tolerate alternative visions. A nation loses freedom not when power concentrates, but when dissent ceases to matter. Tyranny begins not with the fist, but with the dismissal. The people do not recognize the end of liberty because the ritual of liberty continues. Elections still occur, courts still convene, newspapers still publish, but the substance has drained from the shell. The tyrant will always claim necessity. The free citizen must always question inevitability. Liberty cannot be preserved by institutions alone. It requires a populace unwilling to trade autonomy for convenience. A constitution is only as strong as the people willing to resist its reinterpretation. Every emergency creates precedents, and precedents become habits. Thus, the softest tyranny arise from temporary measures made permanent. Tyranny rarely begins with violence. It begins with administrative enthusiasm. The sovereign who centralizes power out of frustration becomes the sovereign who retains it out of fear. Liberty dissolves first in the imagination. Once citizens internalize the state's version of necessity, they no longer defend what they no longer believe they deserve. The tyrant's shadow grows as the population forgets the taste of self-governance. A free people must remain unreasonable in defense of their rights. Liberty dies with its defenders become polite. The temptation triumphs when power convinces itself that it must be absolute in order to be effective. And thus every republic must renew its suspicion of authority, lest authority renews its suspicion of liberty. Collapse without revolution. The slow dying of systems, the inertia of decline, the quiet undoing. All civilizations collapse in fire, many collapse in paperwork, procrastination, misaligned incentives, and a collective forgetting of how to maintain what was once revered. The long fade begins not with catastrophe, but complacency, when citizens assume the system's durability and thus stop tending to its fractures. Institutions do not fail suddenly, they become hollowed gently, their forms preserved long after their functions have evaporated. Collapse without revolution is the tragedy of deferred responsibility. Everyone sees the decay, yet no one feels authorized to arrest it. The long fade is marked by a population that knows something is wrong but cannot articulate it. Malaise replaces outrage, drift replaces decision. A nation can endure corruption, incompetence, even conflict, but it cannot endure meaninglessness, the sense that action no longer changes outcomes. Decay becomes normalized. Statistics are reinterpreted, failures reframed, expectations lowered until disaster appears merely inconvenient. In the long fade, language collapses before infrastructure. Euphemisms proliferate, metrics soften, promises inflate, a reality contradicts. Elites remain comfortable throughout decline. Collapse is always experienced first and most acutely by those furthest from decision making. The state becomes performative, its gestures towards solutions without enacting them, preserving only the theater of governance. Citizens navigate the ruins of former certainties, making private adaptations while the public sphere crumbles unnoticed. Collapse without revolution is the triumph of entropy over will. The system dies not because someone kills it, but because no one saves it. The long fade converts political energy into fatalism. Individuals stop imagining alternatives and begin preparing for survival. When the future becomes smaller than the past, collapse has already begun. Bureaucracy metastasizes in failing states. Paperwork multiplies as competence dwindles, as if complexity could substitute for function. Decline becomes irreversible the moment people adjust their aspirations downward and call it realism. The long fade hates revolution, not because revolution is violent, but because revolution is decisive, and decisiveness has been bred out of the population. Collapse can be invisible until the moment it is undeniable. Systems fail slowly, then all at once. A nation may survive crisis, but it cannot survive the loss of the capacity to respond to crisis. The long fade ends when the populace, exhausted by ambiguity, demands clarity, even if clarity arrives in the form of authoritarian certainty. The absence of revolution creates the conditions for a later, more devastating one. Deferred reckoning becomes intensified reckoning. And thus, civilization dies quietly, not because the people desire destruction, but because they became accustomed to living with decay. That is part 16. I'm Abe Zucca. Check out my art at zuccagallery.com. Google the name Abe Zucca. And I will see you guys later.